All right, it is Friday, November 7, 2025. Welcome to the Borderlines podcast, Canadian immigration law podcast. And we are joined today by Phil Gurski. Phil is a retired career with CSIS, most of career with CSIS as an intelligent agent. Feel free, I saw you kind of move your head a bit. If it's
I actually spent 17 and a half years with CSE, which is the Communication Security Establishment, or Canada Signals Intelligence Organization, before I joined CSIS in 2001. So my career was actually almost cut right down the middle between CSE and CSIS.
Yeah, and Phil is also now the president of Borealis Group. He is the host or co-host of two podcasts, Canadian Intelligence A, which I think you said has a backlog of about 300 episodes, one-on-one interviews with you and different individuals pertaining to national security and other topics.
Yep.
And then a podcast that I recently subscribed to after doing a previous podcast with Christian Lane, who's a CBSA, a retired chief at CBSA a few episodes ago.
Super fascinating podcast, that episode.
Yeah, got a lot of good feedback. And I was asking him questions about CSIS, and he said, you'll have to ask someone from CSIS, which is what led to this episode. But the podcast that I strongly recommend, I've listened now since probably about 4 or 5 episodes, and it's Spies Like Us, which is 3 retired CSIS officers, one of whom is Phil, in kind of like this podcast, just talking about developments in Canadian national security law. It's and I think you're drinking as you record the podcast.
Yeah, we like to say it's 3 old spies in a virtual bar where the beer is real. And you can imagine that, coming across 3 old guys sharing old war stories and talking about what's wrong with the world today. That's kind of what we do.
Oh, and it's super interesting. And it's not very formal.
Well, it's irreverent.
I constantly refer to Trump. It took me a while to realize who you were talking about, but Trump is always referred to as President Cheeto.
Emperor Cheeto.
Emperor Cheeto, right. Sorry, Emperor Cheeto. And it's just a fun listen. One of the questions I did have, just before I forget, was you guys have been talking about how the reason there's no foreign intelligence registry yet is because there's a dispute over the color of the carpet. Is that a joke, or is that partially accurate?
With the Canadian government, you never know. I spent the 18 months into my career with Public Safety Canada in the National Security Directorate, and we used to joke it took 6 months to approve a PowerPoint slide. And as someone who spent 32 years in operations, and all of a sudden now we can't approve a PowerPoint slide. No, we are joking about the color of the walls, although I think it should be fuchsia. But the reason we harp on this is that this was one of the strongest recommendations that came out of the Hogue inquiry, which of course was looked into Chinese interference in our elections, and that was almost 2 years ago, and they still haven't appointed a commissioner to look at a foreign registry. So this is why we think it's the color of the carpets that's holding things up.
Right.
Yeah, maybe that's also what's holding up the gun buyback, because I think 5 years ago they declared that a national emergency, and not one gun seized yet or bought back. One other question I did have. So I was chatting with a Department of Justice lawyer yesterday about us doing this topic, and when I explained Spies Like Us, the Department of Justice lawyer went, holy moly, they must have like all of active CSIS watching in, listening. Did they reveal something? Has that been expressed as a concern? Are they listening? I assume a lot of active people at CSIS are the audience, because there is some of what you talk about that goes completely over my head.
Well, yeah, and we are getting good feedback from our former colleagues. Some of whom, like us, are retired, and some of them are still working. They're saying, hey, keep doing what you're doing, guys, because you're saying what we can't say in the public sphere. But we also look at amongst the 3 of us. So it's Al Tredenick, myself, and Neil Bisson. The 3 of us have more than 90 years experience in national security. We know exactly what we can say and what we cannot say. So we know what lines we can't cross. We know what details we can't disclose. We can talk about things in generalities, but the rule about intelligence is, as long as you're not revealing ongoing sources and methods and operations, it's pretty well on the table. But the problem is, here in Canada, we don't have nearly as many people as, let's say, in the States, where you can't cross the street without tripping over an ex-CIA or FBI officer who's gone public about his or her career, right? So, we're careful, but we're also, because we're retired, we're not beholden to current expectations or current policies and things like that, so we can get away with stuff that people who are still in the jobs can't.
Yeah, that's fair. We hear that from a fair number of people in government. And the reason, kind of now moving into the substance, which is CSIS's role in Canadian immigration screening, about a year ago, and this was one of the back catalog episodes that I went and listened to, you talked about security screening in the study permit context. And one of your co-hosts, Neil, was spent 5 minutes rallying off all these statistics about what % of students get screened. Yeah. And I remember, I can't remember if it was Phil or the other co-host's name's completely slipping my mind. Phil or Al said oh my God, Neil, no one's going to care about these in-depth statistics. And I was listening going, no, I care. I'm super interested in this. And so now we have the chance to fully talk about this for next half hour.
Well, I do want to make it quite clear. I never myself worked in security screening. I was a counterterrorism analyst with CSIS, but obviously I have colleagues who did. Most of the investigators, IOs, intelligence officers, do spend at some part of their career in security screening, often earlier in their careers. And then there's a bunch of people who are permanent screening officers who are not intelligence officers, not IOs. Yeah. And their job is to, if you're given a name, you basically do whatever background checks you can to determine should this person be allowed to come into the country or not.
Mm-hmm. And I think the way to start, I guess, would be, so this is a chart I compiled from going through all the...
Wow, impressive.
All the, every year CSIS publishes this year-end report, I guess you can call it.
Yeah.
And they say how many referrals they got for permanent residents, refugees, citizenship, temporary residents, in total. Yeah. And there have been big delays in security screening at CSIS. And so I was curious, is it IRCC is sending more, which I think is what people had thought, or is it something else? But the first kind of starting point, even before getting into which files get screened, is in the last few years, there's been a huge increase in the total number, right? 293,000 in 2021 to 538,000 in 2024. Has resources been increased? I don't actually know CSIS's budget, how many people are involved in this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm really glad you brought up this chart with the numbers, because they do show an extraordinarily rapid increase. And I would say a lot of that has to do with the fact that the previous government doubled our immigration per year in terms of letting people into the country. I mean, at some point we were between 250,000 and 300,000. Then they kind of made it to 500,000, plus the increase in international students. I mean, the numbers just kept going up and up and up. Whether or not it's being resourced more, I don't have an answer to that question. I hope the answer is yes. But I think it's important to point out, too, that, within the security screening branch at CSIS, which is by far the biggest operational branch that CSIS has. So, the kind of the main operational branches are counterterrorism, counter-espionage and foreign interference, and counter-proliferation, so weapons of mass destruction, and there's security screening. And it is head and shoulders above, those other branches, because it has to be. They probably will never have enough resources to look at these files, because the numbers keep going up and up and up. And I think your listeners have to realize, too, that they can only look at whatever information that they have, right? So we have a database. Obviously, we have our own internal database that looks, investigations that we've done. We have access to other databases as well. But there's only so much information out there. And if you put, John Doe into the system, and John Doe returns with no hits, and you're asked, well, should we let John Doe into the country? Your answer is, well, we don't have anything nefarious or anything that says you shouldn't. But I think what that points to is that, if you don't have anything, that's maybe a sign you should try to get something. Well, that implies an investigation. An investigation takes resources, and it takes money, and it takes time. So I think that, Canada, as and I completely support this, as a nation of immigrants, a nation that's very pro-immigration and has been for a very long time, although the numbers are shifting right now. We do have to do our due diligence too, and I think in making sure that the right people are coming and that we're keeping out the wrong people.
For sure. And one thing that I notice here too is that while the number of permanent residents sent for security screening has remained relatively stable the number of citizenship referrals has ballooned.
Well, they all get referred to CSIS, every citizenship file.
Yes, that's correct.
Which is part of, so like, there must be a triage that goes on, because as you said, like, I would imagine a temporary resident who's being referred or a permanent resident, someone at IRCC has said, this person needs comprehensive screening.
Mm-hmm.
All citizenship, like, I would imagine the overwhelming majority is just based on lots of like processing times.
Yeah, I would think so. And I think the other thing that, your listeners should bear in mind too, is that when we're talking about citizenship, we're talking about making people permanent, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to have Canadian citizenship. They're going to have all the rights and freedoms that Canadians enjoy. And again, we want to make sure that we're not granting citizenship to people who may have lied on their application, may have affiliations to terrorist groups or criminal organizations or foreign states in terms of espionage networks. Because once you get the citizenship, as you're probably aware, it's really hard to get rid of it. In other words, revocation of citizenship is, it's not that it's unheard of, but it's an extremely laborious task, and it takes years, if not decades. And I can talk about cases that have been 30 years in the making in terms of trying to get rid of people here in Canada that shouldn't be here. So I think that's probably the reason why CSIS plays such an important role in those citizenship requests for information on citizenship. But as I said, it becomes a numbers game. And if you're under the previous government, I know there were cases where pressure was placed upon CSIS. Well, maybe don't take as long on these cases as you normally do, because you really want these people in the country right now. And my first reaction is, you've got to be kidding me. Given the background of some of these people, you want to take more time, not less time, to ensure that, in fact, you're not letting into the country people who have experiences, affiliations, or whatever that are injurious to Canadian public safety or national security.
I guess it's just that they've already been here for many years. And I guess that's, I think, when you're talking about protecting Canada's security, that the emphasis, like that so much of the resources are used on people who've been in Canada for many years, as opposed to those who are seeking to enter fresh.
Yeah, and so you raise a really good point, Deanna. I think that, so the case I'm citing specifically is Gaza. Over the past couple of years, a lot of pressure. Obviously, what's happening in Gaza was horrendous. The number of civilian casualties, the starvation, the destruction, the disease, et cetera. And I'm not taking sides in that particular, but there was a lot of voices saying we need to bring people to Canada from Gaza to free them from this horrendous conflict between Hamas and Israel. And I said, well, yeah, we all see the humanitarian catastrophe, and we all have hearts. We don't want people to see, children starving and people dying, but we're talking about a territory that's run by Hamas, which is a listed terrorist entity here in Canada. And this is the last time, or the worst time where you want to expedite your security screening process, because people could in fact be coming to Canada who are members of Hamas, which again is a listed terrorist entity here in Canada. And you don't want them, to come into the country. In terms of people who've been here a long time, I'll raise a term that I'm not sure you've spoken about in your podcast in the past. It's something I have a great deal of experience with. These are so-called national security certificates. So these are people who've come to Canada on a variety of files, whether they're refugees or temporary residents or students or whatever. And it's only after the fact that they've gotten here that we realize there's something wonky here. And there's 5 cases that I worked on quite a bit over a better part of a dozen years of people that had direct ties to Islamist terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and groups in Algeria. The problem is that once they got a toehold in Canada, they lawyer up pretty quickly. And to date, of the 5 cases that I can remember, not a single person has been deported. Not a single person has been removed. In fact, one got citizenship and I think is suing us for $35 million because we investigated him. So this points to, I think, some huge problems within the system itself.
One of the questions I asked Christian, and I'm curious to get your take as we kind of talk about this, is it seems like, and maybe there's more choices, but Canada kind of has 3 choices. Number 1 is to go more lax on security screening. Number 2, it gets stricter and more restrictive on immigration. Or number 3, in order to prevent, say, espionage or terrorism, that surveillance of citizens increases.
Wow.
Christian said that he didn't think it would be number 3, and that he thought that it would come down to either more restrictive immigration or just opening the floodgates, for lack of a better word. Do you kind of see those as sort of the 3 choices as well, or?
Well, there are 3 terrible choices. I would say that there should be a 4th choice, and that is a great deal more front-end screening. And by front-end, I mean offshore. So if you're coming to Canada, let's say, I'll pick a country at random from Syria, then, before you get your travel documents, your plane ticket, whatever, there has to be a mechanism in place that the security screening takes place in Syria and or the closest Canadian representation to Syria. I don't know if we have an embassy in Damascus anymore. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But that's where the security screening should take place, not after you've come here to the country. And we have to get better at doing that at the front end. Now, in terms of surveillance, I mean, let me assure your listeners that, yeah, CSIS does carry out investigations under which, surveillance and human sources and warranted intercept, all that stuff obtains. But those are cases against people where there's a reasonable grounds to suspect they pose a threat to national security. It's right in the CSIS Act. That's what CSIS does for a living. It doesn't surveil 40 million Canadians because that would be a waste of time and it would be dumb. But, there are times where there's a legitimate grounds upon which to do that. As to your other options, opening up the floodgates would just be stupid. And, given who is the president south of the border, as you mentioned, spies like us, we call him Emperor Cheeto. Can you imagine Canada being seen as lax on security screening? Why, that would just be something that would just infuriate. That'd be the reason for several all caps texts at 3:00 in the morning, and would have a huge impact on our bilateral relations. And the other option about cracking down more. Well, as well as I do, we're a country that thrives on immigration. We're not meeting our population goals of, 2.1, births kind of thing. We can't exist without immigration. So, cracking down, although we have reduced the numbers under Mark Carney from what they were under Justin Trudeau, but, saying we're going to stop immigration is simply a non-starter as far as Canadians are concerned.
How, and this is like your an area of your expertise, how do you screen for radicalization when someone's here?
Well, luckily, so when I was with the service from 2001 2015, this was after 9/11, obviously, and counterterrorism really assumed a major role in our investigative priorities. In fact, it's the reason why I was on secondment from CSE at the time, so Communication Security Establishment. That's why I decided to stay at CSIS, because I was an Arabic linguist, a Farsi linguist, so I could understand the Middle East, and we were starting to see like-minded people here in Canada. So beginning in the early 2000s, we started to think, what does it take to make someone a terrorist? What steps do they go through? And more importantly, what are the indicators? What do they do? What do they say? And so we developed a whole system of indicators that were consistent with, in this case, Islamist terrorism. And there is a similar set for, far right terrorism, far left terrorism, and Jewish terrorism, and Sikh terrorism, etc. But we were able to say, based on our investigation, say, yeah, if people start doing these types of things and saying these types of things, there's a good chance of becoming radicalized along lines that could lead to an actual act of violence. And if I may, I was able to turn that experience we collectively gained through better half a decade and a half. That was my first book. It was called The Threat from Within, published in 2015 when I retired from the CSIS, which describes in quite detail what are the signs of radicalization. Because what we were finding out is that we knew what the signs were, but the general public didn't. And I'll just briefly cite, I interviewed 2 mothers whose sons had gone off and died abroad fighting for Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever kind of thing.
From Canada?
They're Canadians, yeah. They're both Canadians and died abroad in terrorist attacks. And first of all, it was a very painful interview to do, as you can imagine, talking to the parent of a dead terrorist, right? But what struck me is how little they realized what they were seeing. They didn't understand what their sons were going through. They didn't appreciate for what it meant, and didn't know what to do about it. Didn't know who to call. Didn't know what was problematic, what was just teenage angst or whatever. And as a consequence, their sons left Canada and ended up dying. And so they're living the rest of their lives saying, if I'd known this earlier, could I have done something about it? And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book in the first place. So we have a solid understanding of radicalization. One last thing is the challenge we had as a security service was that the vast majority of people who exhibit signs of radicalization never do a damn thing. Mm-hmm. They don't pick up a gun, they don't make an explosive, they don't drive a car into a crowd, either because they're cowards, they're incompetent, or they're stupid. So it's not a one-to-one mapping between radicalization and action. And we learned that quite quickly. Yeah. The challenge from a security service perspective is, well, which ones do you investigate and which ones do you say this guy's not serious? Because if you get something wrong, you're on the carpet. Why did you not watch this guy? And that was the challenge from a security intelligence perspective.
Yeah, it really is such a conundrum because you talked from the outset about problems with with inefficiencies built into a security screening process. Is that when you're tied to working with a database that has limited information, that prevents timeliness.
Yes.
And things shift so rapidly, I'm sure, in this space. And so delay can also lead to radicalization, I would imagine, because it leads to disenfranchisement. And so, it's that trick of trying to balance, effective security screening while also trying to not create these breaches in our international obligations and our desire to be humanitarian. And, it seems like what you're saying is that you're trying to make a case, if I'm not wrong, for more front end investigative work as opposed to this back end, anyways, I'll let you expand on your.
We're constantly playing catch up.
Yeah.
We don't have the resources to look at the number of files that are presented to us. And as your statistics show quite clearly, it's just getting more and more all the time. And again, when you have government saying, and I'm not making this up, this was, based on reliable sourcing, that they said, well, you might want to expedite some of these cases because we really want these people in the country now. And that's the wrong circumstances to expedite the system. Mm-hmm. I'll also throw in there something that bothers a lot of us that worked in security intelligence, and it pertains to law enforcement as well. We have a very lousy national security culture in here. We have a lack of an intelligence culture in Canada. What I mean by that is that the people that run the country, the politicians, don't understand intelligence. They don't understand national security. And they don't treat it as a priority. Why don't they treat it as a priority? Because most Canadians don't treat it as a priority. So if you're running for election in Etobicoke, right, and you're for the Liberals, let's say, for example, and you're campaigning, that when you develop your platform, give your stump speeches, and enter into debates with other candidates, nobody cares about national security. They care about what's the price of bananas. Can my kids afford to buy a house tomorrow? What's going to happen to inflation in the next 3 or 4 years? Are the Blue Jays going to win the World Series? Nobody cares about national security. And that's why
they do care about, do my constituents think that I've made a stand for national security? I mean, I think it sometimes gets to that level, but in terms of actually a nuanced investment on what it actually takes to protect national security, I think that's something entirely different.
It is, and it only matters when something happens.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, something blows up, something happens. Look at the theft of technology from a level 4 lab in Winnipeg by Chinese members of the Communist Party, right? That happened on someone's watch. As it turned out, my colleagues at CSIS that work the China file have been raising red flags saying these people shouldn't have access to this lab. And for whatever reason, and I don't have the answer to this question, they're allowed access and they stole technology, which was very, very sensitive and had to do with, viruses that could be weaponized at some point.
I think that one's been particularly confusing because documents are blocked from being presented to Parliament and everything. Just sort of, that's been also another issue is that when it comes to interference, it seems like a lot of the knowledge about it is only because certain individuals were giving stories to journalist Sam Cooper, who we've also had on the podcast.
Absolutely. And I'm a friend of Sam's and I really respect the work that he does. But, let's face it, the Hogan inquiry and the previous Johnson report that predated that, which was an absolute waste of time, only came about because someone leaked a CSIS report. Now, where that leak came from, I have no idea. It could be a CSIS person. It could be a customer. I don't care. I don't know. And frankly, I don't care. But the fact that Bob Fife and Stephen Chase from the Globe Mail got that report and put it on the front page of the Globe saying CSIS has been warning about interference for decades and no one's doing anything about it, I think it illustrated really how little national security matters. And then we found out that the Prime Minister was either reading or not reading intelligence reports. We found out that some of his team were sending reports back for rewording because the wording was too strong and they didn't want to upset China. And then the prime minister accused CSIS of being anti-Asian racist for suggesting China was spying on us. I mean, it just got worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
And again, to me, as somebody who spent more than 3 decades in the business, we did our best every day to present the best intelligence to officials to use for decision making. To be told it's not making a difference, they're not even reading it. Well, it kind of saps your morale at the same time, right?
Is part of that, like with the former minister Mendicino, like whether he was receiving documents, is part of that, and this maybe gets into the issue about just the process. Like my understanding is that the briefing notes from CSIS aren't allowed to be sent fully electronically, and that he was supposed to go into a room where he may or may not have been allowed to take notes. I have a case right now where there's big national security concerns involving one of my clients. There's been a special advocate appointed.
Yeah.
And to access documents, he has to go into has to drive to Ottawa.
Yeah.
Not allowed to take notes. And so it just like the process of actually learning concerns, maybe less about that specific, like on the lawyer side, but on the politician side, it seems a weird way to like just expect that people, I guess, would remember what they read in these binders.
It is a problem. And I'll go back, excuse me, to my days in SIGINT, where we had officers that were implanted full-time in various departments, and their sole job was to ensure that the people with a need to know got access to SIGINT, because SIGINT's about as high, it's the most sensitive you can send, right? See, there's nothing more sensitive than SIGINT. Whether that's appropriate or not is irrelevant. But so signals intelligence, that nothing gets more highly classified than that. And so what would happen is my colleagues, I have a very good friend who spent 20 years in the department, and his job was to hand deliver these documents to senior officials on a daily basis, but he had to be there while they read them. And the problem was, if it was really, really sensitive, you couldn't take notes for fear those notes would disappear somewhere or be found somewhere else. And yes, in some cases, people had to go to a special room to read this stuff because it was what we call a SCIF, so a compartmentalized facility that was, shielded, et cetera, et cetera. And we all know human nature. If I have to go down across the street, or let alone across the province, to read something that's relevant to my case, I'm not going to do it because it's a pain, right? It's not convenient for me to do so. So that is part of the problem. There probably are ways around it in terms of, secure methodology, encryption, et cetera. But the bottom line is that, again, the convenience issue notwithstanding, if I don't take the time to read the information that's going to help me make better decisions and policies because it's based on intelligence, then that illustrates to me that you don't really think intelligence is worth taking the effort to do so.
If I may, I mean, as an outsider kind of observing the way that the security mechanism works in Canada, it's sort of what you're saying is that the security apparatus just is not effectively resourced to do the work in the most efficient and intelligent way that it could be done. And what it seems to me as an outside observer, seeing the way that the security screening machinery works, is that kind of blunt instrument triage mechanisms end up being developed because they're just kind of the easiest, which does run the risk, I feel, of like resorting to things like profiling. And while that might be kind of like, to go back to the choices that Steve gave, it means you cast the net a whole bunch wider. And then, yes, there are delays, but at least there's less risk. And I don't know. First of all, I'm just going to leave you with that. And do you think that that's fair to say?
Well, it is a conundrum. Like I said, you got more files than you have resources. And so you have to prioritize, what are, I'll give you a good example. At some point, we had applications from countries X, Y, or Z would always go through a rigorous process. Now, is that profiling? Yeah, sure, but it's based on past experiences. If you're emigrating, I'll say from Denmark, let's say, you're probably going to get less attention than if you're emigrating from Iraq or Iran. That's just the nature of, we know what happens in Iraq and Iran versus what we know what happens in Denmark. The problem with that is that the vast majority of people who emigrate from Iran or Iraq are not a problem. And it's possible for someone from Denmark to be a problem, even if we don't give it the attention. To me, though, and this is where the system really breaks down, is, people don't realize that CSIS has no decision-making authority within the Canadian. We're an advisory body. It's right in the CSIS Act. We collect intelligence, we process it, we provide advice to the government of Canada on national security. That advice can be taken, ignored, thrown in the garbage, put on the bottom of a bird cage, whatever kind of thing. And I think what worries me, and again, I'm not speaking to this out of any experience in security screening itself, is that a lot of things that we have to say, because they're inconvenient or because they go against things that people want to believe, or because a good example is, we're trying to reset our relationship with China right now on trade. So do you think the government wants to hear CSIS talking about all the Chinese efforts to what we call transnational repression, harassing Canadians to not criticize China, Chinese police stations in Canadian cities, Chinese efforts to affect the federal election by busing in people who aren't Canadians? You think government wants to hear that message right now? Of course it doesn't want to hear that message, because its priority is to reset the relationship with China. Therefore, all this great intelligence, which is advisory in nature, goes into someone's inbox, and that's as far as it gets.
Yeah, I'm still surprised how little media attention that got the students who inappropriately voted in that election. But so that kind of segues to the question that I asked Christian. What I've thrown up on the slide here is from the NSIRA. Whenever you do a CSIS complaint, once the matter's done, they produce this chart that kind of shows the progression of a file, which is the person applies, submit their application to IRCC, and then sort of what's interesting actually is with citizenship, it just goes to CSIS. With permanent residents, sometimes it goes to CBSA, sometimes it goes to CSIS.
Okay.
And I don't fully understand what CSIS does that CBSA doesn't.
Well, again, I'm going to be careful here because I never worked for CBSA. So, in fact, you should probably have Neil Bisson on your podcast at some point, because Neil did work for CBSA before he joined CSIS. So Neil's one of the triumvirate from Spies like us, and he'd be a really good guest, I think, to talk about this. We have access to different types of information. Now, as a security intelligence service, our partners are other security intelligence services around the world. So, of course, you have MI5 in the United Kingdom, you have ASIO in Australia. You have the FBI, CIA, because Americans don't have a CSIS. They don't have an internal security. They're one of the few Western powers with an actual security service, which is kind of strange when you think about it. The FBI is purely law enforcement. The CIA is a foreign intelligence service. It's not a domestic intelligence service. We have our European partners, et cetera, et cetera. My guess, and this is purely a guess, and you'd have to ask Neil this, is that CBSA couldn't go, let's say, to the Pakistani security service and say, "What do you have on Phil Gurski?" Because they wouldn't have that kind of relationship. Whereas CSIS, under the way it's structured, under what's called a Section 17 arrangement, which is the part of the CSIS Act, can talk to any security service or law enforcement agency in the world, as long as it gets a sign off from Foreign Affairs and Public Safety to share information. Now, obviously, certain countries are easier to share than others. Western European partners, like-minded democracies, versus Pakistan and Iraq kind of thing. But I would just simply, suggest that it's the types of information to which the various organizations have access. And as a security intelligence service, the fact that intelligence is in the name of CSIS, whereas intelligence is not in the name of the Canada Border Services Agency, suggests to me that CSIS has access to much more intelligence than CBSA would have, although CBSA would have their own unique sources. They would, I'm sure they share with CBP in the States and whatever the British equivalent is, kind of thing, et cetera, et cetera. But, this is where I think more hands are better than fewer, because they're all going to have their own perspectives. They're all going to have access to information, both domestic and international. And what you want to do is to develop the fullest picture possible so you can make a decision on person X, Y, or Z. All these agencies have weighed in with what they know. Here's the best, I guess, data dump that we have that speaks to the applicability of this file, where the person should be granted citizenship or permanent resident status or whatever kind of thing. And the more people around the table, in theory, the better that decision should be, because it's based on a greater amount of information from the start.
So do you know why it's the case that for citizenship, CBSA isn't involved, at least according to the NSIRA and most of these, but for permanent residents, CBSA is?
I have no idea. It was just the way that it was divvied up in terms of responsibilities. I mean, logically, it doesn't make any sense to me. Again, and I'm biased, right? I'm ex-CSIS, I'm not ex-CBSA. But as the country's security intelligence service, it should be the primary organization that vets anything that has to do with entry to the country, because that's our mandate. Our mandate is to report on threats to national security and public safety. CBSA does a great job of what it does, right? But again, it doesn't have the relationships that CSIS has. And I don't know, is there a CBSA Act? I have no idea. No idea what it says. But it seems to me that your security intelligence service should be kind of the top banana when it comes to advice on files like this, because that's what it does for a living. Whereas, and again, I don't know CBSA in detail, so I would defer to someone like Neil on that. And they definitely have a role to play, but CSIS is the one you want, I think, trolling through this stuff at the beginning, because if there's an obvious hit saying this person should not be allowed to come to the country, that's the person you should be listening to.
But also, Steve, perhaps it's just the fact that, like, for all the time that person has been here as a temporary or permanent resident, they would have had the CBSA would have had the powers created under IRPA to make a 44 report, to, make a report on inadmissibility. And so, that continues to, they can do that during the citizenship application process and forestall the citizenship grant. Yeah,
because CSIS can't do that rule order. But the other, but then CBSA often, is, I guess, that you see the same interview at questions asked twice. I mean, the other thing that I find
about the lost efficiencies,
from CBSA officers is that CSIS does the security screening under Section 34 and almost never does the human rights violation screening, or whether someone is in the top half of a designated regime that has committed human rights violations, because CSIS does security screening. But where someone ranks in the Iranian government seems very intelligence-y to me. And so do you know if that's accurate, where that distinction kind of comes from?
I don't. But again, you have to go back to what is the organization's mandate.
Yeah.
And the organization's mandate is, does this person or this group of people pose a threat to national security as defined by Section 2 of the CSIS Act? So Section 2 of the CSIS Act has four categories, A through D. So foreign espionage, foreign interference, terrorism, and sabotage or subversion. That's what CSIS does. I'm not saying that CSIS ignores human rights. We do not. I do know when we used to share information with certain agencies that were under regimes that were problematic in terms of the human rights record, we would make it quite clear that we would not, we're not authorizing, we don't want human rights to be violated in the obtaining of this information, kind of thing. But it's not part of its mandate. Its mandate is, does this person pose a threat to national security? It's up to somebody else to determine, the regime is this and that kind of thing. And let's face it, we also recognize it's about the veracity of the information we receive. To the best of our ability, we corroborate it through multiple sources. Just because you heard from a particular regime that Phil Gurski is a problem, well, you judge how relevant, how accurate is that source? Are they unbiased? If I'm an Iranian dissident and the Iranian government says don't investigate or don't allow Phil in because he's a threat to national security, well, you judge the information based on the people that gave it to you. And if I'm a vocal dissident of the Iranian regime, chances are the Iranian regime is going to call me a terrorist or call me a threat to national security. And this is why, when you work in intelligence, it's all about, I always use this line, in real estate, what are the three main things in real estate? Location, location, location. Well, in intelligence, it's corroboration, corroboration, corroboration. And you try to ensure that the information you got is accurate and that you can corroborate it from multiple independent sources. That's the key there. They have to be independent sources. And if you do that, you have much more confidence in the veracity of your information. And we're constantly, putting in our information, this is a source of unknown reliability, or this is a source of confirmed reliability. And there's various ways in which we confirm reliability. I won't get into the details here, but that's what a security service does. And I'm not dismissing human rights considerations or concerns at all, but it's not the mandate of CSIS to worry about that.
I want to backtrack a bit because I'm still digesting some of the stuff you said at the very beginning, which is that, let's say you're going through security screening and you put in somebody's information. There's no hits in your databases. This would be something done by a security screening officer.
Correct.
Would the further investigation be done by a security screening officer or by an analyst?
Again, I don't know for certain, but if I go back to the CSIS Act, if there are reasonable grounds to suspect the person posed a threat to national security, it could lead to a full-blown investigation, which would be carried out by an intelligence officer. This is what they do for a living, is they do investigations. They recruit human sources. They can arrange for physical surveillance. They can go to court with an affidavit to obtain a warrant under Section 21 of the CSIS Act for interceptive communications. But again, it's a numbers game, right? If you put 100 names through the system and you get nothing back on the 100 names, so in other words, they haven't crossed your radar. There are none of your databases. Which ones do you pursue and why? Is it a spidey sense that says, "Wow, this person seems a bit dodgy," whereas that person does not? I don't know how that decision is made, never having worked it. But again, I will simply raise what I said before, in that when you work in this environment, first of all, you don't investigate everybody because you can't. You don't have the resources. It would be a waste of your time. But all it takes is one mistake or one perceived mistake. And someone gets in the country and does something, and people say, "Well, where the hell was CSIS? Where the hell was CBSA?"
Well, that's always the CSIS will never get credit for who didn't get in. It will always
nobody cares when we get it right.
For sure.
And when it came to the student who was came here as a student and was then from within Canada, if I understand correctly. Anyway, it was within Canada that it came out.
Yes, it was a Pakistani student.
He was going to go, he wanted to go to New York. I don't even know if that could have been screened overseas versus if someone, as you were saying, is radicalized here.
Exactly. It's really, really hard. And then, of course, I mean, we're not going to investigate all 500,000 or 300,000 international students, right? I mean, we don't have the mandate to do that, really, and we don't have the resources to do it. But it does point to a really important issue, is that when you've got a government that seems to put no upper limit on foreign students, on immigrants, on temporary residents, you're literally inviting people with nefarious intent to come. And the important thing, and I want to stress this, guys, the bad guys know this. The bad guys know that we don't screen everybody.
Well, I think the one this has been in the news a fair bit, and I guess it would be an exception to the general how Canadians may feel about national security, is the Bishnoi gang.
Yes.
Where my understanding is that people in that gang did apply for study permits. It's not the case that it was all people who joined after they were here, and that gang was sending people as students and as farm workers.
Yeah. And again, I will blame the system, because let's face it, why did we up the numbers on foreign students? Because it was a cash cow, right? Foreign students pay 3 to 5 times the tuition that Canadians do. And this is why you're seeing, this is kind of tangential to our conversation, but this is why colleges and universities are screaming right now, because the cash cow has been slaughtered.
Yeah.
And
we've been asking, was it deliberate on the federal government's part to increase? Did they just lose control of what
I think it's a combination of both.
Doing? Yeah.
I think it's a combination of both. But again, and part of it too is the lack of a security culture. And part of it is that who would come to Canada with nefarious intent? And it is a further issue here, again, that I want to underscore for you and your listeners. Other countries are noticing, not just our adversaries, but our allies. And I'm hearing this from multiple sources. We're being seen as the weak link. And if you're a Canadian working in security, intelligence, or law enforcement, what's your greatest fear? Well, you always want to stop something from happening here. What's your greatest fear? Is that Pakistani student going from Mississauga, getting on a bus and being caught in Ormsted, Quebec, on his way to New York to blow up something in the name of ISIS.
Yeah,
because if a Canadian crosses the border and does that, you think the relationship is on edge right now?
Yeah. You've talked about the weakest link, and that was actually the exact terminology that was coming up in my mind. I know it's an impossible question perhaps, but I'm just interested in your thoughts are where in this CSIS or in the security screening chain do you see as being the weakest link?
I would say the insufficient deployment of resources abroad within our embassies and consulates. That's where it has to start.
I see.
So if you get 1,000 Indian students showing up at the consulate in Mumbai, all wanting student visas, they shouldn't be handed out like candy. Oh yeah, just fill in these forms. The other, of course, I would say another huge weak link is the so-called immigration consultants that have sprung up like weeds, right? Mm-hmm. And there's got to be some kind of, again, I'm not an immigration specialist, but there's got to be some kind of system to vet who is putting out their shingle as an immigration consultant, because a lot of
the government that regulates it now.
I know.
It's, under the government's the new I mean, they're introducing a regime at some point this year or next to start fining both consultants and lawyers who facilitate fraud.
Yeah. It's about enforcement overseas, though. I think
it is
the biggest problem.
Well, and there's a movement away from visa offices, right? Everything's becoming centralized,
and that's the scary
in Canada.
part. Because, like I said, once you get a toehold in the country, we have a broken removals process. Mm-hmm. So again, I worked on cases of people that have definitive links to Al Qaeda, and then one of the other issues which we don't have time to talk about is the whole intelligence to evidence issue, which is hugely problematic in Canada. CSIS information is not collected to an evidentiary standard, which means it can't be used in court. So that's huge. But, once people get here, you're here for good. We have a terrible removals policy for all kinds of reasons, some legitimate, like human rights violations, some for reasons I'm not entirely certain what they're based on. But the fact remains is that people know that if they successfully come here, in other words, they're not screened out at the front end, as you said, Deanna, in a consulate or an embassy or whatever abroad, they're in.
It's reactive rather than proactive.
We have,
and even the reactive is not effective. From what you're saying,
is terrible. Reactive is terrible.
Yeah.
We have some questions coming in on Instagram, and some people asking if questions are allowed. Questions are always allowed. Before we get to the first, I do want to just say on the Bishnoi gang, you guys on your podcast, Spies Like Us, had a episode that talked about the Bishnoi gang. So I encourage people to check it out. I've been contacted by immigration consultants who normally wouldn't say stuff like this, but they're freaked out a bit by what's going on. I don't have any, my knowledge of it is just through the media, but I think it's something that definitely
we're seeing as
their comments have been, if it was any other community, the national security focus would be very different. But because at least these people who have contacted me have said, because it's the East Indian community, no one seems to paying attention, but they are.
That's a whole other conversation.
Some of the extortion going on.
Yeah, I appeared yesterday in Parliament on this, the Bill C-12, the borders, enhancing border security and all of this thing. And the focus is again on mass cancellation of applications. But again, to me, it lacks the sophistication, it lacks the intelligence to go along with canceling all applications from a certain region or canceling all applications,
it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
100%.
There's there's no nexus. And I'm not advocating this, but one consultant from that community said that he would love to see everything canceled until this is sorted out.
Wow.
So again, I don't know that much about the actual what's going on, but other than that, people who normally don't have this opinion seem pretty scared.
Yeah, this act is moving forward, and I think it's just a matter of how the limitations can be put in to make it more effective. I think really that's what we're grappling with.
And everything I think that they took out of Bill C-2, from what I understand, might just be in the budget. So they're just redirecting it. So question one, does CSIS have timelines to complete security screening?
I don't have a direct answer to that, but I think the answer might be twofold. One, there's a resource constraint. Mm-hmm. If you do an initial kick at the can and nothing comes up, I mean, you can't sit on something indefinitely waiting for something to come up. So I think that's sort of a built-in kind of timeline. And secondly, there's the pressure, which you've seen in the past in the government, to expedite these things. So there might be pressure on CSIS to, well, don't take too long on this file because we really, really want this person in the country, or we want this community, or whatever kind of thing. But I'm not aware of a specific timeline per se, because if something does come up, then an investigation has to be launched, and investigations can't be restricted by timeline. Investigation takes as long as an investigation takes.
Yeah.
So one of the sources of this pressure is through, I guess, lawyers like Deanna and I who file mandamus applications. Mm-hmm. Which are federal court applications to compel IRCC to conclude processing. Mm-hmm. Big issue that's kind of arisen here is IRCC will say, well, there's security screening with a partner agency, and pretty much every judge except one, which is going to be the question, has said that in of itself is insufficient, that absent some specific information about an individual, just saying it's with CSIS, essentially. They don't actually say CSIS, they just say partner agency. Could be CBSA. There's one judge who in a decision called Jiao a couple weeks ago said, you know what, these types of court orders to compel IRCC to conclude processing should never be granted when there's a security screening that's ongoing. There's specific legal reasoning involving the entitlement to a visa. But I guess my question is, do you think this is something the court should be compelling IRCC to issue visas in a certain period? There's one line of jurisprudence which even says in the permanent resident context that the security screening can occur after someone gets PR, so security screening shouldn't delay permanent residence. Based on what you've said so far, I can kind of anticipate what you'll think about that line of jurisprudence, but I'm curious as to your thoughts about the court's role in and the applications that I think Deanna and I file somewhat regularly on.
Okay, well, I'm going to be pretty blunt, okay? My way of looking at things is nobody who is not from here has a right to be here. There's no inherent right for us to grant you temporary residency status, permanent residency status, visa status, whatever. There's nothing that says we must admit persons A, B, or C. We do so because it's in our interests. It can be our economic interests, it can be in terms of bilateral interests, political interests, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, I would say no. There should be no mandated "thou shalt do this," because these people do not have an inherent right. This is going to sound awful, and I'm sure people are going to call me all kinds of names for this, but these people simply do not have the same rights that Canadians do because we're lucky to be born here or have become citizens. And as a consequence, as I said earlier, investigations take time, and those investigations have to be allowed the time to proceed in order to get the best answer possible.
Yeah. By the same token, I think that what we've talked about today is a lack of resourcing for a function that we consider to be fundamental. And so if that's really the core of the issue, then mandamus litigation should be saying the point of mandamus litigation is that the government needs to adequately resource its function in order so that it can be done in a fair and measured way. And, just delaying not only is, a problem because it takes too long, but also because it actually scuppers the ability to do the job effectively.
Yeah, and again, quickly on this point, well, let's just grant them temporary residency status and do the security screening after. Well, that's putting the cart before the horse, as far as I'm concerned, for the reasons we've already talked about. Once here, always here, and the removal system is badly broken. So that's a very backwards way of looking at things. I wouldn't recommend that as a former security intelligence.
I don't think that's how it works in mandamus at all. But point taken. Yeah.
I'm going to assume you don't know the answer to this, but the NSIRA recently sent an email to everyone with complaints saying that the NSIRA had met with CSIS on the immigration screening side to try to figure out a systemic way to reduce complaints and address security screening. I'm going to assume either you can't say or don't know kind of what that was.
Yeah, no, I don't. But again, let's face it, it's human nature, right? If you've put a file forward and you're informed, oh, by the way, we have found something, or the government has found something which it goes against your application for whatever status you want, and as a consequence, we're not going to grant you that. Someone's always going to say there's bias in the system or whatever kind of thing. So they're always going to want to point a finger at somebody, right? Because it's in their interest to gain that status. And so I think that, we have to look into, and again, my bias as a former counterterrorism specialist, very few people put up a hand and say, oh, yes, by the way, I'm an Al-Qaeda terrorist.
No, that's part of why I like your podcast, because like on lawful access, I listen to a few other legal podcasts. They're all very critical of lawful access. You guys took a different approach in some recent episode. I'm going to rotate between Instagram and YouTube. SRV Lenny says, if someone is in a relationship with someone who has extreme beliefs, would CSIS still lean on the side of caution in their recommendation? Bit of a specific question, but I guess, does CSIS look at that, who someone's friends with?
Oh, absolutely. because we have to determine, I mean, how far does this spread? And, I worked on cases where there was a primary person of interest under investigation, and it turned out there were immediate family members who were equally of concern. So, and it goes back to what I said earlier. Just because someone says, I didn't know anything about my spouse's, my brother's, my son's, my cousin's views, okay, that's that person's version on things. But we have a mandate to look at, well, are they telling the truth? In other words, is this person a source of confirmed reliability? Mm-hmm. Or are they simply saying things because they know they're going to get in trouble if they admit, oh, by the way, I was well aware of what the person was planning on doing or thinking, blah, blah, blah. I just don't want to admit that because it makes me look bad. So
I've seen this even in the context of organized crime allegations.
Where, well, yeah, exactly. And this is not, CSIS casting, an incredibly wide net. It's CSIS doing its due diligence as a security intelligence organization. And I'll just, I know I don't want to belay this point, but, you're probably familiar with the Toronto 18 investigation way back in the 2000s, mm-hmm. something I worked on from day one. Only 18 people were ever charged, 7 of whom were actually released. Or I think 11 of whom were found guilty and many got time served. That investigation was a lot bigger than 18 people. But at the end of the day, the Crown decided we only have enough to go on. You're probably familiar with, how the Crown makes decisions to go to court, right? They don't want to lose. They don't want to go to court to win. So if they don't feel the case is strong enough for the other 40 guys, whatever the number was, they're not going to advise they go to court on that. But every investigation is usually larger than the one person of interest. Whether or not the other people are equally involved, that's what investigations are done to make that determination.
Yeah. Also Instagram. This is probably, the question is how common are confirmed cases of foreign espionage in Canada? You mentioned the Winnipeg lab leak. I think there's a case in Quebec right now where someone who worked for Quebec Hydro or something has been charged. Sort of the big story in Canadian immigration from a security standpoint is, well, I guess Iran, Gaza, and then China with espionage. We did the episode with Sam Cooper, the United Front.
Yeah.
How big a deal do you think this is?
Well, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. And I'm talking as somebody who began my career during the Cold War when, the Soviet Union still existed and we had, the old IRCC security service. So my career actually predates the creation of CSIS. That's how old I am. It was the old IRCC security service. And the IRCC security service was largely a counter-espionage service. It was all about Russian illegals and Bulgarians and other East Bloc people. Then we kind of got the so-called peace dividend after the wall fell and after Soviet Union dissolved, blah, 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 blah. But you don't have to be a rocket scientist to read the open source to see that this is something that's hugely important. I'll also say that, interestingly, after 9/11, we really kind of retooled to do counterterrorism because we had to. And we took resources away from counterintelligence, counter-espionage, because we had to. But nowadays, the threats are equally dangerous on all levels. And my concern, as somebody who's been retired for more than a decade, is do we have enough resources to do them all simultaneously? And I think the answer to that is no. So this is why I'm curious about the budget in terms of, whether CSIS will get more money, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of confirmed cases, that's kind of a hard one to answer because a lot of cases are never confirmed in the public domain. People are either just removed, declared PNG, persona non grata, and punted, or there's other things going on. And one of the things that intelligence services like to do with spies is to try to turn them, make them work for you instead of working for the other guy.
Yeah, I know I have one client who had that wasn't sure why CSIS was interviewing them, and it turned out that it was a recruitment thing.
Absolutely.
But so in the jurisprudence has sort of evolved, and IRCC's approach is kind of, or I don't know if it's CSIS's or CBSA, is a sort of, I think the system is trying to figure it out. Like the lead decision kind of remains the main decision on this, which is 2024, that anyone who may be coerced by China to return to China or from within Canada, divulge any information that they get here could render them inadmissible for espionage, even if at the current time they don't have that intention, they may be coerced in the future. How do you screen for that? Like, that seems super broad. And I was wondering, like, how did CSIS, because that would, you read that and you're like, well, that could be anyone from China.
Literally.
When the procedural fairness letters in some cases go out, they cite Chinese national security legislation, which says the state can compel anyone to be a spy.
Yeah.
CSIS obviously hasn't taken the approach, or IRCC or CBSA, that everyone from China is inadmissible. So how do you actually?
And again, I just need to plug that in the context of Bill C-12, if that becomes law, there could be a mass cancellation for anybody. I mean, the joke that Steve and I like to make is for doing science while being Chinese.
Yeah. Well, you raise a really great question. And again, I'm not a China specialist. I'm not a transnational repression specialist, although I did write a paper on transnational repression in Canada about a year ago.
Interesting.
It's a huge challenge. And you're right. I mean, in theory, the way, and China says this quite publicly. If you are a Chinese citizen abroad, your first loyalty is to the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. That is your loyalty. And we know the methods they use. We know the coercion, threatening a family, et cetera, et cetera. We know what's happening. What are there? 1.3 million people of Chinese extraction in Canada, somewhere around there. Does that mean we've got 1.3 million possible spies? In theory, I guess the answer is yes. In practice, the answer clearly is not 1.3 million. The challenge from a security service perspective is which ones are more likely and which ones are least likely. And therefore, how do you focus your resources, right? It goes back to my old talk about radicalization. Out of 100 people that radicalize, only 6 are going to do something.
Yeah.
So how do you choose which 6 out of 100 to look at? And again, same issue. We've raised this issue time and time again. It comes down to resources. What do you have the resources to investigate?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it has been. I mean, the other thing that's been interesting is and this kind of reiterates what you say about the national security culture. No politician has commented about it. It's all just, and that creates all these questions of does that originate from CSIS, IRCC, CBSA? Where are these policies actually getting developed? Which is last Instagram, and maybe last question is transparency in all of this. One of my complaints in dealing with CSIS is the kind of opaqueness is to such a point that when you do an Access to Information Act request, to even just say, hey, what's the status of the file? When it's returned, the name is redacted, even though you're the person who made the request. And as a lawyer who submits a bunch of them, you wind up saying being like, okay, try to piece together who this client might be if there's 5 outstanding and I've got a redacted name even. And the CSIS will always say, we can't tell you. Well, it differs. This is another I don't quite understand. Sometimes CSIS will say, we can't tell you about the status of your screening, including whether it's done. And sometimes they'll say, we're pleased to tell you your security screening was done and passed on a year ago.
Right.
And sort of where that even comes from.
Okay. My answer may surprise you and some of your listeners. As somebody, again, who spent more than 32 years in the business, I'm actually an advocate for more rather than less transparency. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is I'm out. I don't work there anymore. I no longer have a security clearance. So when I do my podcasts and when I do my interviews and when I write my books, I'm basing myself on OSINT, open source intelligence, open source information. So the more that I have, the better I can make my comments, kind of thing, whether it's for the media or whatever. Secondly, when you have a lack of transparency, you create a vacuum. And when you create a vacuum, it gets filled. And it gets filled not always in the best possible way. Let me draw a little analogy here for you. Whenever something bad happens and, the police will launch an investigation, what do you constantly hear? We cannot say anything while the investigation is ongoing. And I understand that. You don't want to taint the evidentiary stream. You don't want to bias possible court cases. But take a look what happened last year in the United Kingdom, where a guy stabbed a bunch of little girls outside of a dance studio, and the police wouldn't say anything. As a consequence, a bunch of people said, well, I know who the stabber was. And they gave a name, and they claimed he was a failed Syrian refugee claimant in the United Kingdom. What did that lead to? Riots in Dublin, riots in Southport, riots across the United Kingdom. It turned out it was a kid from Cardiff, a kid from Wales, who wasn't a Syrian refugee. In fact, he was of Rwandan extraction kind of thing. So I think that while there are legitimate reasons for organizations like CSIS to be a little bit stum on what they say or not say, when they basically don't say anything, it invites people who have no idea what they're talking about to fill that vacuum for you. And it can create a situation. I'm not talking about, riots necessarily breaking out in the streets of Toronto, but it does complicate matters to an extent. So I think that these organizations should develop some way to say what they can say without jeopardizing the ongoing investigation, but does provide some information that people can say, okay, we now have a better understanding on what's happening and how it's happening. Thank you for that. We can move forward, kind of thing. So, yeah, I get the secrecy. Look, I worked in sales intelligence for 17 and a half years where we didn't even exist as far as Canadians were concerned. And I find that all kind of a little bit, that's kind of like the 50s. We kind of compat, especially in an information age where information is instantaneous. Oh, and by the way, going back to that Southport attack, I was contacted by somebody on social media saying, I have the name of that stabber. And they gave me the name of, it was like a Syrian name. And I asked the person, well, what's your source? And they wouldn't give it to me. So I'm sure as hell not putting that on social media. And it turned out to be wrong, right? Because it was a source of unknown reliability. So I'm not going to repeat that. But yeah, I think when organizations like CSIS or CBSA or, IRCC or whatever don't say anything, they're inviting trouble because someone will say it for them.
Yeah.
And the person that says it for them will have their own vested interest in mind.
My last question, and probably the biggest kind of complaint that I have made in court arguments is there a reason from like a operational standpoint why CSIS on the security screening can't say where someone is in the queue? So part of what I've been arguing forever is or as long as I've been doing this is, it's clear that it's not first in, first out.
Right.
And there's this, the government is trying to say the delay is reasonable, but they're not even saying where someone is in the queue.
Right.
And it seems like a lot of these issues I think a lot of people's complaints is just, here's where there's this many people ahead.
Right.
We anticipate, maybe not even even just this, this is where you are in the queue.
I don't have an answer to your question, but given that CSIS on an annual basis publishes how many files they go through. So you had that stat at the very beginning, right? Like X number of hundreds of thousands of files. The public knows that CSIS has been asked to look at 100,000 files in the month of October, let's say, for example. Saying that this particular number is, sitting at 98,000, I don't see how that breaches national security. There may be other reasons of which I am unaware, having not worked in security screening. But again, going back to the earlier question about transparency, to me, there's nothing that jeopardizes an investigation to say, yes, we're working on it. And, we think it'll take this amount of time to finish, or we don't know when it'll finish, but here's where we are. We have a 6-step process and you're on step 3 without even having to name the steps themselves, right? You don't have to go into the details. I don't see why that'd be problematic. It just, again, I understand the mindset because it was my mindset for 32 and a half years, but this notion that everything is secret and I could tell you what I have to kill you, it just becomes a bad joke after a long time.
I've heard that.
It doesn't help public.
When I was in law school, I contacted a lawyer at CSIS and asked what they do, and they said if I told you, I'd have to.
Yeah,
but so what is the mindset when you're in? Like, what would someone in CSIS possibly say to that question?
I'm going to give you a lousy answer, but I think it might be close to the truth. We've always done it that way. This way we've done it since Eve ate the apple, right? It's just the way we do things. As I do, government, it's like you don't turn a Titanic on a dime, right? It takes a long time to turn. I think that there's some processes in place that become heavily over bureaucratized, and it takes time to change them, and it needs the political will to change them. Number one, and then you got to get the buy-in from people that actually do it. That this is a good way to do things. I will say, I've been rather critical of lack of transparency, but I will say things really have changed a lot. Again, I go back to when I started back in July of 1983, and how much more Canadians know about what our security intelligence agencies do. We are light years ahead of where we used to be. Light years. It's not perfect. It never will be perfect, but we're doing much better now than we used to. We need to do a lot better still. But I think we have to acknowledge that a lot. Look at the factors in the annual CSIS report, number one. I mean, did you guys get those stats useful 5 or 6 years ago? Probably not. So that's a step forward. But I think a lot more steps have to be made forward at the same time.
Yeah, awesome. For sure. Especially if the overall aim is to shift the intelligence culture and to get public buy-in and build resourcing. Yeah, public confidence, 100%.
Yeah, great.
Awesome. This has been fun. Once again, I encourage everyone, Spies Like Us and Canadian Intelligence A. Spies Like Us, and especially, it's become like, it's a really funny and informative podcast.
We have fun doing it. It's our weekly highlight, and the thing is, the challenge we face is what to talk about, because there's always things that are up in the news that week, and we do like a pre-recording kind of talk, like what are we going to focus on this week, and it's really hard to pick. We try to pick 2 stories or 2 things that are up in the news, make it as current as possible, and it's a challenge to narrow down to 2 things per week.
Yeah, but that also keeps the topics super interesting and fresh.
I hope so.
I just want to remember to put in the plug. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying the program on YouTube in particular, because we're very close approaching our next milestone, which would enable more features for us. So, living it in.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Been very interesting, Phil.